Welcome to Kensington Palace, a place of secret stories and public lives. 300 years ago, it was the glittering heart of court life during the early Georgian era. Kensington Palace is a magnificent building with these extraordinary rooms built for pomp and pleasure and wielding power. But beneath this glamour and luxury, there's a very different side to this building as well, which you can see if you come through here. Suddenly, you're in a very different scene, a world of narrow corridors and staircases, a place that would have been inhabited by up to 1,000 servants, moving to and fro, doing a multitude of different jobs, all of them keeping this royal show on the road. Historic royal palaces have been working to lift the veil of the public-facing court and explore the lives of the many people who lived and worked here, in front of and behind the scenes. They've brought together an amazing collection of objects, many of which have never been seen before. The below-stairs area of a royal palace was a rowdy, hectic place. There was a labyrinth of departments, and a rigid hierarchy kept the many royal staff in order. The stairwells and corridors of this palace must have been so busy, so noisy, as hundreds of servants ran around from dawn till dusk doing their day's work. And the way that the great engine of this palace was kept running smoothly, all those servants, all those departments, was through the use of bells. Fittingly, a humble bell is taking centre stage in the exhibition.
This is a very typical servant's bell. And they've been up high on a wall somewhere, pulled by a wire. Obviously when the wire tugs, it will ring like that. They have different sizes to make a different ring, and so that would help the servants register where it's coming from, and they could look up on the board, it would be marked the name of the room they have to attend to. Bells really did rule their lives. So these simple little things like this really do sort of capture the very regulated lives of servants.
A host of people filled Kensington Palace. Pleasure and politics were closely linked as everyone tried to catch the royal eye. But all this finery required a whole pit crew of servants. I'm taking a close-up look at one particularly famous dress.
This dress was made for Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III. It would have been an incredibly expensive dress. You can also see that it's been very finely crafted and has a C's embroidered on it all over for Charlotte.
But for every finely dressed person like this, for every outfit like this, there's an army of people just keeping it in this condition. And there's many of these women walking around court.
It represents so much labour. I think it represents the seamstresses, the dressers, and then the laundry women who would have maintained clothes like this, who had tremendous amounts of work to do. And laundry women were actually quite high up in the royal household, were relatively well paid. They had a salary, but they also had an allowance for the things they needed, sort of a clothes chest to keep the clothes in, the alum and starch and other things that they would use to maintain the clothes. So they were relatively well paid, high status, but all the women working under them who'd done the actual work would not have been so well paid. We have to thank these people who maintained the clothes for this survival, the fact that we still have this.
Contrasting Queen Charlotte's extravagantly detailed dress, the exhibition also showcases the humble uniform of a woman who played a role in dressing her in finery. Compared to all the extraordinary outfits I've seen in Kensington Palace over the years, this is definitely the most modest, but it's equally important.
It is really important because the apron is a genuine survival of something a servant wore, and we have very few such items. So this belonged to a woman called Mrs. Thilke. She was a dresser to Queen Charlotte, and we know a little bit about her because she's mentioned in Fanny Burney's diaries. Fanny Burney was mistress of the robes, which was a kind of relatively high up position. Fanny Burney talks about what a pleasant woman Mrs. Thilke was and how much she appreciated Mrs. Thilke's presence, because she talks about how she would not have known in what order to give the pieces of clothing to the Queen had it not been for Mrs. Thilke sort of handing them to her in order.
So we think of the 18th century very stratified, very formal, huge inequality. Actually, it sounds like there were relationships here at court between very grand people, even monarchs, and normal people who were their servants.
Yes, because these are the people who surround the Queen daily. So, Fanny Burney talks about how the Queen would read her newspaper throughout the time while she was being dressed and read out bits to her. So there was a relationship there. And then she had a relationship with Mrs. Thilker.
Kensington's rooms were full of servants of all classes, keeping the royal machinery running. Some of the tools of their trade are going on show for the first time.
So this is a really unusual object for a very peculiar sounding job. This is an ice saw that would have been used by the keeper of ice and snow at the palaces, whose job was to collect ice from the canals and the ponds around the palaces and to save it as long as they could in the ice house, which is a big insulated sort of tank. And it was there specifically for the fashion for having ice desserts and ice drinks, and also for cooling champagne, of course, which is another fashion of the time. Generally, these jobs were held by men. That was how the court worked. But occasionally, we'll find a woman has taken over one of these roles. This particular role in George III's reign, in about 1775, a lady called Frances Talbot took over the role. And it's quite a prestigious role in a way, well paid, over £100 a year, which is quite a substantial salary for the time. And she probably inherited the job through either a husband or a brother, and obviously successful with the job and kept it. And this happens with a number of quite unusual roles, such as the rat killers as well. We have a woman in that role.
Compared to exhibitions that you guys have done here around the Queens or people like that, has this been much harder? You have to do lots more digging and sleuthing to find these objects?
For us, this was about doing an exhibition around the people who did the work, but they are often people who don't really have names and records, because the names and records are often of the wealthy and the privileged and the people who have status. And so trying to find records for underrepresented people is sort of like an anomaly, an oxymoron. How do you do that? And so digging around these stories has brought items to light, but there are things we're never going to know, but that leaves more to the imagination.
We can all recite the names of the kings and queens of Prime Minister that walked those corridors of power. But I'm embarrassed to say, until this trip to Kensington Palace, I hadn't really thought much about the other men and women who played a vital role in keeping the court going. People born high and low, who had different jobs to do. Some of them almost obscured from the historical record, but their stories are there and great researchers have found them. And it means that we can now build a much more real, much more vivid picture of royal life in this palace.